I'm Dave Bartram, and for 38 years I was the frontman and lead singer with the rock and roll band Showaddywaddy. The run of chart success which we enjoyed during the 1970s is a fact of which I'm immensely proud, and in 2013, 40 years after the band's formation, Showaddywaddy, unbelievably, are still on the road, entertaining fans up and down the UK. Although I retired as a performer in 2011, I continue to handle the band's managerial affairs, which I've done since the mid-1980s. It was in my role as manager that in 2005 I accepted a run of 33 dates at a chain of holiday camps stretching the length and breadth of Britain's bucket and spade resorts. With summer fast approaching, the thought of a few weeks by the sea seemed distinctly appealing. And to make the package even more attractive, the leisure company we were dealing with would throw in accommodation to boot, which would help to keep our expenses to a minimum. The temptation was there, and I remember thinking at the time, surely the venues can't be that bad, and the chalets and caravans they provide us with will be more than adequate. Won't they? This had to be worth a punt. What I'd failed to take on board was that even as seasoned performers, we would be entering into uncharted territory. And from experiencing life in the fast lane, the band were about to undergo a breakdown on the hard shoulder. This is the story of a tour to end all tours. 10 weeks that strained every sinew and emotion, virtually to the limits of human endurance. Our crew manager, Steve, could not be described as a people person, and most certainly didn't suffer fools gladly. Come to think of it, dear old Steve didn't suffer anyone gladly. So I realised that the next few weeks would not be easy, as prior to my own arrival at any of the camps, I would have to bear the brunt of Steve's wrath by mobile phone. And furthermore, I would be forced into making apologies and excuses to the staff on site he'd rubbed up the wrong way during the load-in, when the band attended the sound check a little later in the day. It wasn't as if we hadn't performed at any holiday camps before. Indeed, a few years back we'd played 26 consecutive Sundays at venues that weren't dissimilar at all, many of which had been great gigs, and the travelling, although tiresome, must have helped toughen us up for what lay ahead in the coming weeks. However, many of the gaily coated brigades that worked these camps had serious attitude problems, often brought about by excessive working hours, particularly when it came to crew members to whom they considered themselves vastly superior. Such behaviour would not be well received by our infamous road manager and would undoubtedly cause major difficulties. I'd pre-warned the grumpy crew boss that we would simply have to grit our teeth for 2.5 months and get on with it, and that perhaps we could laugh about it over a beer when the tour was over. But he typically remained stony-faced as ever, and even blew a deep, gruff sigh. The sun was in the sky, the temperatures had soared to 21 degrees Celsius. Summer had arrived, and the first gig was fast approaching. Monday, July the 18th. The first show and overnight stay was to be in Grange-over-Sands on the craggy Cumbrian coast, not far from the renowned Lake District. With the lake's reputation as one of the UK's loveliest areas, the expedition seemed destined to kick off in a positive mode, which to a degree, I suppose in retrospect, it did. The band showed up in our well-travelled Toyota Previa to discover that everything had so far gone according to plan. A number of able-bodied humpers had been waiting on site to assist the crew. Steve had instructed them efficiently and been on his best behaviour, and the modest rig had been set up with a minimum of fuss. The party would be spending the night in 4 caravans, and although we were expected to bunk up together, there were 2 bedrooms in each caravan, so the only thing we'd really have to share was a bathroom. The brightly attired rep who handed me the keys melodramatically emphasised that these were not just caravans, but were prestige class. There's only platinum class that are superior to these, he added. I smiled to myself and optimistically imagined that things may not turn out to be so bad after all. The notice board in reception listed some quite fascinating forthcoming attractions. The Immaculate Deception, a tribute to Madonna, vied for attention alongside The Cool Crooner, featuring the music of Sinatra, Dean Martin and Andy Williams, who was on the following night. In fact, the programme consisted of tribute after tribute: the Beatles, Elvis, the Eagles, Kate Bush, amusingly called Fake Bush, Queen, ABBA. The list went on throughout the entire season right into September. My attention was particularly caught by three rather rotund guys who hilariously went by the name of the Gastric Band. The blurb read, "A comic tribute to the three tenors." I chuckled, wondering whether this was a play on words, referring to the 30 quid they were possibly getting paid. Ben, the duty manager, hand outstretched, came from the dugout to greet me, and I commented on the number of tribute bands they seemed to have on their entertainment schedule. "Funny you should say that. We've already had your tribute here. The one featuring Freddie Rock," he informed me. I was well aware that there was a band called Showaddywaddy out on the circuit paying homage to our good selves, but in all my experience, I'd never yet come across the legendary Freddie Rock. "Was he any good?" I questioned. That's a matter of opinion. I sincerely hope the real thing is a lot better," Ben replied diplomatically. The stage area was a lot smaller than we were used to and didn't fully comply with the technical specifications that had been pre-arranged. But, that said, we'd play the odd worst gig, and I was desperate not to rock the boat on the opening night of the tour. Plates of chunky sandwiches, sausage rolls, and large pots of tea and coffee were generously provided as we wound up our shakedown, and spirits were optimistically high. After what had already been a long day, it was now time for a pre-gig chill-out in front of the television in our prestigious caravans. Though the park had appeared to be pretty deserted during daylight hours, by 10 p.m, the show bar where we were set to perform was absolutely packed to the rafters. Where on earth had everybody suddenly surfaced from? It was something of a mystery, but every performer loves a full house, and the ensemble's nerves soon settled in anticipation of a wild night before a well-oiled and enthusiastic audience. We played a tight 70-minute set before a perspiring but appreciative crowd and scurried off to our trailers to raid the fridge and take an early-ish night. 3 weeks prior to that first gig, I was sceptical at the likelihood of being away from home for any extended period of time, as my dear old mum was hospitalised after the most serious of a number of recent falls. I'd visited her every day that I could, and can still to this day picture her face lighting up each time I strode into the ward where she'd been propped up against a pile of pillows. She'd been in and out of hospital for some years now, with various age-related problems, but this time was different. She'd become tearful and unhappy, and was eating precious little, and the family visits that lit up her day were just about the only thing keeping her going. Notwithstanding, the road awaited, and Mum would have been furious had I as much as contemplated a change of plans that would selfishly involve letting anyone down. Being in a band is in many respects similar to being part of a family, in that each member bears a responsibility to the others to get on with things, generally, whatever the circumstances. Our bags were packed and it was heads down, full throttle, into 33 undiscovered two-wheeled townships. Tuesday, July 19th. The opening night had been well received and encouragingly had boosted everyone's confidence. The caravans had been comfortable enough, and there was just cause for optimism as we ventured further north into bonny Scotland to the coastal town of Ayr. We'd long possessed a fondness for the Scots and had played many wonderful concerts at some incredibly atmospheric venues throughout the untamed but hospitable land. The haggis bashers, as we jokingly referred to them, would invariably afford an exuberant welcome and loved their rock and roll with a passion. In my experience, and at the risk of sounding patronising, the Scots indeed have to be amongst the most receptive of all audiences the world over. In the 70s, we'd performed a number of concerts at the legendary Glasgow Apollo, and I'd previously gone on record as saying it was my favourite gig on the planet. Watching the top balcony literally vibrate and throb to the rhythm of the loud music and the crowd's exaggerated exertions still makes my nerve ends tingle to this day. We actually played the Air venue some years before when it was an all-singing and dancing holiday centre with high-tech facilities and a generous entertainment budget that brought in some big names. By 2005, however, the camp was almost unrecognisable from its former glory days and probably hadn't seen a lick of paint in 10 years or more. The public buildings had become shabby, discoloured and depressingly drab, and the whole place was sorely in need of a makeover. On a turbulent, chilly July day that felt more like November, there was an air of discontentment and dampness all around, which combined with the aroma of stale chip fat lingering in the wind, made for a depressing backdrop. The on-site eateries didn't look particularly tempting either, with a cluster of down-market pizza parlours and copy McDonald's joints on offer that I was adamant I wouldn't be frequenting for the duration of the tour. During the weeks building up to the stint, my caring wife Kathy had put me on a healthy food regimen. She was familiar with my rock and roll tales describing the rigours of the road and had come to realise I'd more than likely be indulging myself in excessive portions of fast food throughout the trip, and thus responded by serving up innumerable greens and high-fibre rations as part of my new and disciplined diet. It was lentils and haricot beans with everything, and after around 10 days of the stuff, the sounds emanating from my rear end simulated that of a light aircraft. I persevered along an avenue of moribund stores selling cheap souvenirs and candy floss in search of the sparse supermarket I'd been led to believe was on the same thoroughfare. My hunt was to prove fruitless, literally. I found the shop, but it sold no fresh fruit, wholemeal bread, or indeed anything that looked even semi-appetising, and I eventually emerged having bought a bottle of Lucozade and a gooey pink frosted donut. The health kick was on the slippery slope already. Lead guitarist Danny, bass player Rod, and myself are the band's lovers of the great outdoors, so we decided to take a pre-soundcheck stroll and sample our first blast of sea air. Upon our return, we ventured forth into the lounge bar cafe, which in reality was just a posh name for the canteen. I sampled an appalling imitation of a chili con carne, which with its lack of spice tasted just like an insipid bowl of beef stew with a few added tomatoes, and was bland and full of gristle. It hadn't even been cheap, but with no desire to wind myself up, and in an effort to distract my taste buds from the flavourless slop, I sat and counted a total of 3 red kidney beans in the entire sorry concoction. Already with 31 camps ahead of us, I had begun fantasising about a succulent rack of lamb dinner, or a traditional home-cooked Sunday roast, while pondering how prison food would compare to the unsavoury swill put before me. Soundcheck came and went in the pretentiously named Atlantic Show Bar, which may well have sounded glitzy, but in reality bore no relation to the trappings and opulence of its infamous Las Vegas sound-alike. Just the reek of stale alcohol and a well-worn tartan carpet that squelched underfoot with every tentative step. Nevertheless, the stage area was spatial, and everything was set for the evening's performance. The gig itself began swimmingly well, although every now and then the lights seemed to flicker and dim, almost as if the grid were close to overload as the power intermittently surged and faded. Then, 20 minutes into the set, a screeching, whining, high-pitched tone was heard that gradually increased in volume and began to drown out our own cacophony of sound. Within seconds, several brightly coated members of staff were on hand, basically disappearing up their own backsides and waving their arms in a disorderly flap, urging everyone to leave the building with immediate effect. This signalled an almighty stampede towards the fire exit at the rear of the building, and in no time we found ourselves outside on the pavement, surrounded by a group of exuberant, lobster-faced holidaymakers. The month undeniably was July, but the bitter brass monkey weather came as a huge shock to the system, feeling much colder now that our perspiratory glands had opened up from the exertions of the first 20 minutes of the set. Stood in a close-knit circle, the boys slapped their shoulders and arms in a bid to mollify the rising goosebumps, until eventually we were allowed back inside, where a maintenance man informed everyone that the kitchen's electrical system was playing up and had tripped the venue's oversensitive alarm mechanism. The band now faced an uphill task, but once the boisterous crowd had returned to the room, it was decided to simply get back out there without delay and launch into something punchy which would smack 'em right between the eyes and doubtless restore the good-humoured temper with immediate effect. We were sadly mistaken. It seemed as if our rekindled overture had fallen flat on its backside, and that the happy campers were more concerned with ordering large rounds of drinks as insurance against any further interruptions. To make matters worse, a void had developed between the stage and the packed bar areas to the rear of the complex, and the mood had become strangely muted as we now played second fiddle to the headlining bartenders. We stuck at it and eventually managed to rouse some of the crowd into getting up and dancing. But that apart, the earlier buoyant ambience had most definitely been soured, and in all honesty the final hour was heavy going. Following an encore that felt fraudulent and burdensome, we disconsolately changed and disappeared to the sanctuary of our dilapidated chalets.